Tonight, we journey back to a time before central heating, supermarkets, and electric blankets, to the frozen winters of medieval Europe. While nobles feasted in stone halls, peasants faced the biting cold with only firewood, fermented grain, and generations of hard-earned knowledge. This is the real story of how ordinary people endured months of darkness, hunger, and frost with almost nothing, and survived. So before you settle in for the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening from. Now, get comfortable, and let's uncover how medieval peasants made it through the coldest season of the year. Winters in medieval Europe were unforgiving. Long before central heating, insulated walls, or thermal clothing, peasants faced the cold with little more than determination, resourcefulness, and what few materials they could gather throughout the year. Their survival depended not on comfort, but on strategy, tradition, and endurance. The typical medieval peasant lived in a one-room wattle and daub house, a frame of wooden beams packed with woven sticks, coated in a mixture of mud, straw, and dung. The thatched roof was prone to leaks and drafts. There was often a central hearth, but no chimney. Smoke from the fire would fill the room before escaping through a hole in the roof or gaps in the walls. This smoke, while unpleasant, served a secondary purpose. It preserved meats hung from the rafters and helped drive out insects. Preparation for winter began months in advance. By late summer and early autumn, the urgency to gather resources accelerated. Firewood was essential. It was collected from nearby forests, sometimes legally, sometimes not. In many regions, peasants were forbidden by law to cut down trees, especially those on noble land, so they often gathered fallen branches or dead wood. These were dried and stored under covered lean-tos or piled close to the house to limit exposure to snow and rain. Food preservation was equally critical. Without refrigeration, peasants relied on salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting. Pork was the most common meat preserved for winter, especially after the annual autumn slaughter of livestock that could not be sustained through the cold months. Cabbage, onions, root vegetables, beans, and grains were stored in root cellars or clay-lined pits, protected from frost. Ale and sourdough provided crucial calories when fresh produce ran out. Malnutrition was a constant threat. Most peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet heavy in pottage, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and sometimes bits of meat or fat, cooked over the hearth and eaten repeatedly. Bread was another staple, often made from coarse rye or barley flour. The wealthy had access to finer wheat, but peasants relied on whatever was cheapest and most available. In hard years, bread might be stretched with fillers like ground acorns or pea flour. Clothing was layered but rudimentary. Wool was the primary fabric used, spun from sheep and woven at home or locally. Peasants typically wore a linen undertunic, covered by a heavier woolen tunic and cloak. Leather shoes were often worn until they fell apart, patched repeatedly, and stuffed with straw or rags for warmth. Gloves and hats were prized. In colder regions, animal pelts might be used, though these were expensive and not widely available to common folk. But even with all these preparations, winters were harsh and mortality rose. Disease spread more easily in the cramped, smoky interiors. Hunger weakened immune systems. For many, surviving the winter was less about thriving and more about enduring until spring returned. Looking back, it's striking how resilience was woven into everyday life. The medieval peasant didn't expect ease or abundance. Winter was not a surprise. It was a cycle, a force to be respected. Every tradition, from when to harvest to how to build a wall, was shaped by centuries of adaptation to cold. Their knowledge didn't come from books. It was passed from generation to generation, tested each year by frost and fire. In the medieval world, the hearth was the heart of the home, but it wasn't enough to heat an entire space during the brutal winter months. Most peasant homes lacked chimneys until at least the 12th or 13th century. Instead, the fire burned in a central pit or on a simple stone base, with the smoke rising into the room before escaping through holes in the roof or the gable. The result was an interior that was dim, smoky, and often suffocating. Despite the discomfort, this design offered some advantages. The lingering smoke helped kill bacteria in the air and kept insects at bay. It also dried herbs and meats hung from ceiling beams. But even so, The open hearth provided limited heat. Only those closest to the fire felt warmth, and the rest of the room, especially near the walls or sleeping areas, remained cold. To cope, peasants adapted their living habits. Entire families often shared a single bed or sleeping space, bundling together for warmth under coarse woolen blankets, animal furs, or layers of old clothing. Straw mattresses were common, sometimes with additional layers of rushes or dried leaves. In the coldest periods, it was not unusual for animals, especially pigs or chickens, to be brought indoors at night. Their body heat helped to warm the living area, and they were protected from predators and the elements. Clothing was also worn constantly. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep in their daily garments, especially during freezing nights. Outer cloaks, caps, and socks made of wool were highly valued. Washing clothes or bathing was rare during winter, not just due to the cold, but because heating water was resource-intensive and the loss of body heat could be dangerous. Peasants also relied on architectural techniques to retain warmth. Houses were built low to the ground with thick walls, and doors were kept small to reduce drafts. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny and unglazed, often just holes covered with wooden shutters, cloth, or thin animal hide. These coverings were closed tightly at night and during storms. In some regions, peat or dung was used alongside firewood as a fuel source. Both burned slowly and steadily, offering consistent heat over long periods. In the absence of insulation, heat retention came from minimizing space and conserving every degree of warmth. The floors of homes were usually compacted earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes to help trap heat and absorb moisture. These were changed periodically, though never frequently enough to prevent infestations. Daily activities were also shaped by the cold. Work was done quickly and deliberately. Peasants spent more time indoors, performing tasks like spinning wool, repairing tools, and preparing preserved food. Outdoor labor, such as gathering water or tending to animals, was kept brief. Community cooperation was essential. Neighbors shared firewood or food, helped repair homes damaged by storms, and looked after each other's livestock when illness struck. Reflection on this period reveals a stark reality. Medieval peasants didn't simply fight against winter, they adapted to it. Their survival depended on low expectations and intimate knowledge of their environment. Comfort was secondary. What mattered most was making it through to spring with enough strength to plan again. By midwinter, food supplies in medieval peasant households were running low. The abundance of harvest season was long gone, and the preserved stores, dried beans, salted meat, root vegetables, and hard bread, were carefully rationed. Hunger was not a possibility during winter, it was a certainty. The question was not whether people would go hungry, but how hungry they would be, and whether they could survive until spring planting. In most villages, peasants relied heavily on their autumn preparations. Meat was preserved through salting and smoking, especially pork, which was the most accessible source of animal protein. Cows and sheep were usually kept for milk and wool, not slaughtered unless necessary. A single pig, slaughtered and salted in November, might need to last a family all winter. Grain was the other pillar of the diet. Rye and barley were more common among the lower classes than wheat, which was expensive and reserved for the wealthy. Grains were ground into flour at local mills and stored in sacks or barrels. Bread was often coarse and dark, baked in communal ovens or home hearths. In desperate times, fillers like pea flour, ground acorns, or mashed chestnuts were added to stretch the supply. Vegetables like turnips, onions, leeks, and cabbages were stored in cool, dry spaces such as pits dug in the ground or simple root cellars. Some of these stores would spoil by January or February, leaving only the most resilient produce to last through the end of winter. Dried legumes and pulses became a nutritional backbone, offering crucial protein when meat was scarce. One of the most common meals was pottage, a thick, boiling stew made of whatever was available: grains, legumes, roots, herbs, and scraps of fat or salted meat. It was cooked slowly over the hearth and eaten daily, often for both lunch and supper. The longer it simmered, the more flavor it gained, and ingredients could be added or removed over time. In many homes, the pot was never fully emptied. It was simply topped up, a perpetual stew that symbolized both necessity and tradition. Alcohol played an important role in caloric intake. Ale, mead, and weak beer were consumed daily, not only for hydration but also for warmth and nutrition. Water was often unsafe, especially in winter when sources froze or became contaminated. Beer brewed at home, even weakly fermented, was a safer and more reliable option. But even with careful planning, famine was never far away. A poor harvest, an early frost, or too much rain could spoil crops and create immediate food shortages. During the harshest years, people resorted to desperate measures, grinding up tree bark to mix into bread, eating animal feed, or even foraging for roots and leaves beneath the snow. There are records from various parts of Europe describing years when entire communities starved, livestock died off, and the population declined. Communal systems like the manorial granary occasionally offered limited relief. Some manors set aside food stores for times of emergency, and monasteries sometimes provided alms to the poor, particularly during religious seasons like Lent or Christmas. But charity was limited, and social structures often favored the landowners over the tenants. Peasants knew hunger intimately. They learned from their parents how to stretch food, how to spot signs of spoilage, and how to make the most of every crumb. Waste was unthinkable. Every peel, every bone, every last drop of broth had value. In this way, winter was not just a season. It was a test of foresight, discipline, and sheer endurance. As the physical trials of winter wore on, peasants also faced the mental and emotional toll of months spent in darkness, cold, and near isolation. Days were short, nights were long, and daily routines narrowed to simple repetition. Tend the fire, feed the animals, prepare basic meals, repair tools, and wait. In such conditions, spiritual and cultural life became essential to psychological survival. Religion was central to medieval life, and winter was no exception. Christianity shaped the rhythm of the year, with major feast days offering moments of light in the long dark season. Christmas, Epiphany, and Candlemas marked key points in the winter calendar and provided opportunities for communal gathering, limited feasting, and spiritual hope. For many peasants, going to the village church, if one existed nearby, offered both religious comfort and social interaction. Those services were in Latin and peasants could rarely read. The rituals, hymns, and sermons reinforced a sense of belonging and continuity. The message was clear: suffering in this life was temporary. Enduring hardship with faith was virtuous. Heaven, not earth, was the reward. At the same time, traditional beliefs and folk customs blended with religious practices. Pagan remnants survived in local superstitions and seasonal rituals. The winter solstice had long been celebrated before the Christianization of Europe, and in many rural areas, old customs lived on. Villagers might light fires to ward off spirits, leave offerings for protective household deities, or tell stories of ghosts and forest beings during the 12 days of Christmas. Storytelling, in fact, was one of the most important cultural tools for surviving winter. In the absence of books, radio, or entertainment, oral tradition thrived. Families passed long evenings around the fire, telling tales of saints, local legends, morality fables, and personal memories. These stories were not just distractions. They carried values, warnings, and practical knowledge. They kept community identity alive and gave meaning to struggle. Singing and music also played a role, even in the humblest homes. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, or fiddles might be used during feasts or special evenings. Communal songs, especially during holidays, brought brief joy and warmth. Celebrations like Twelfth Night or the Feast of St. Bridget in early February reminded villagers that winter, though still present, was beginning to turn. Community bonds mattered greatly. Mutual aid, both informal and structured, helped people survive. If a neighbor's roof collapsed under snow, others came to help. If a widow ran out of firewood, someone might share a bundle. Though life was hard, survival depended on cooperation. Isolation was deadly, not just physically but emotionally. Winter was also a time for reflection. In the cold and quiet, without the constant labor of the growing season, people had more time to think, pray, and observe. The cycle of life and death was visible everywhere. Livestock dying from frostbite, the aged succumbing to illness, trees bare and still. But even amid the bleakness, there were signs of endurance: green moss on stones, the occasional chirp of a bird, the pale sun inching higher each day. The resilience of the medieval peasant was not just in their body, but in their spirit. They were sustained not by abundance, but by belief in God, in the turning of the seasons, and in the strength of the community. Faith and folklore were not separate from survival, they were part of it. As the grip of winter slowly loosened, medieval peasants began to sense the subtle signs of change. The days grew longer. Ice on the village wall began to crack and melt. Birds returned in small flocks. Though spring was not yet in full bloom, the very air began to feel different, lighter, almost filled with promise. After months of cold, scarcity, and darkness, these changes brought not only relief but a renewed sense of urgency. Winter had been survived, but survival was not the end. It was only a pause in the yearly cycle of struggle. As snow melted, the earth beneath revealed both damage and opportunity. Tools needed repairing, livestock had to be assessed for health, fences and homes patched up from the ravages of storms and time. The stores of food, now nearly empty, were a silent reminder that preparation for next winter had to begin almost immediately. Spring planting was a matter of life and death. Grain sowing had to be done at the right moment. Not too early, lest frost ruin it. Not too late, or the harvest would come too close to winter. Tools were brought out and sharpened. Plows were repaired. Oxen were driven into muddy fields, and peasants returned to the kind of hard labor they knew best. The hunger did not disappear overnight. It often lingered well into spring until the first edible greens or herbs could be foraged. Yet as the land thawed, there was also a sense of spiritual renewal. Easter brought feasting and religious celebration. Baptisms and weddings, often delayed through the harsh months, were held in clusters. Markets reopened. Pilgrims took to the roads again. Life resumed its outward motion. The village, so quiet in January, pulsed with sound and movement once more. Surviving winter required more than just physical supplies. It demanded knowledge passed down over generations. The correct way to build a shelter to withstand snow. The best places to forage for dried herbs or wild onions. Which woods burned longest. How to spot the early signs of rot in stored vegetables. These were not trivial details. They were life skills, embedded in rural memory, refined by centuries of trial and error. The experience of winter also reinforced social hierarchies. Lords and landowners fared far better during the cold months. Their manners were more solid, their supplies richer. In times of famine, they were less likely to go without, and more likely to enforce strict rules on gleaning, wood gathering, or hunting. The divide between rich and poor was never starker than during winter, when warmth and full larders were signs of privilege, and hunger marked the majority. But peasants had their own forms of resilience. Mutual aid, oral tradition, deep familiarity with land and season, these were their wealth. And while the hardships were real, so too was their ability to adapt and endure. Medieval winter, at its core, was a season of endurance. It tested everything: the body, the mind, the social fabric, and the land itself. In today's world, it's hard to imagine the level of preparation and mental fortitude needed to survive such conditions. We live behind insulated walls, with thermostats and stocked grocery stores. But for medieval peasants, survival meant working with nature rather than against it, planning months in advance, and enduring suffering with the quiet belief that spring would come, eventually. Their story is not one of comfort, but of continuity. Year after year, they met the cold not with despair, but with knowledge, habit, and hope. In the frozen silence of winter, they found a way to live.